everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Ashley Boyd. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy here at Mozilla. And today we have a timely topic for our panel discussion. We're going to be looking at the US election. It's a topic that's still very hotly discussed and debated on Twitter and in the news. And we're really going to look at what features and tactics and policies worked in curbing viral disinformation, which are still underway, and what do we need to think about moving forward? And I'm really excited to have a very talented and insightful crew with me here today to unpack the issues and talk about what we should be thinking and planning for in the coming months and years. So joining me today are Ifeoma Azoma, the founder of Earthseed, which is a consulting firm that helps organizations navigate health misinformation. She's also a board member of First Draft News and has worked on the public policy teams at Pinterest, Facebook, and Google. Karen Kornblue is a senior fellow and director at the German Marshall Fund's Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative. Karen is also a former U.S. ambassador and also a former Mozilla fellow. And Davy Alba is a technology reporter with the New York Times covering online disinformation and its global harms. She is an award-winning senior technology reporter from BuzzFeed News in her previous roles. And we look to each of these women and their thinking and insight into these issues on a daily basis. So it's a real pleasure to talk with you live. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
The first question. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, let's dive in because, just a little over 2 weeks after this historic U.S. election, there's so much talk prior to the election about viral disinformation and its effect on the integrity of the U.S. election. It feels like we're still in that conversation, and really the challenges have almost spiked and increased after the election. So I just want to kind of talk with you each, starting with you, Davy, about sort of what's the state of play? What are you seeing? What's the current state of things as it relates to misinformation related to the U.S. election?
Well, I think the U.S. election this year was really unprecedented in terms of the conditions for it. We're obviously in the middle of a pandemic. There was a lot of mail-in votes, and all of that contributed to this reality that none of us really had any previous sort of circumstances to prepare for. So we did know that misinformation was going to be a huge risk on election day and potentially after the election as well, especially since there was a chance that the election would not be called promptly. And indeed, we did see that. So, I've been describing election week as the Super Bowl sized event. And there really was misinformation coming from all sides, about mail-in votes, about voter fraud, widespread voter fraud, about ballots being lost and found magically, vote tallies changing overnight. It seemed like misinformation actors were taking this opportunity, which was this gray area where we didn't know what the results of the election were yet, to throw everything at it and see what stuck. So, that is in some ways continuing on until today. Donald Trump has not conceded the election, which, gives room for these misinformation actors to keep peddling some of these false narratives before there is 100% certainty.
Helpful. In one sense, I saw a lot of, predictions about misinformation spiking if there was a contested outcome. So in some ways, it felt like, as you said, it was like highly predicted. I've still found myself surprised, which, was funny because I was warning other people about it, but it was as we expected. Are there elements of the trend, Karen, I'm wondering, that you've seen that are different than what was predicted, either in volume or the nature of the misinformation that we've seen after the election?
I guess what I was surprised by was that the platforms all knew it was going to happen. They all announced all these plans that they were going to take, and then 2 weeks later they would change their plans or they would react to each other's plans. And yet, although the interventions were, a lot of them were thoughtful, they were some of the things that we'd all been calling for. It felt a little bit in the end like spitting in the wind, given where we are now, what Davey just described. So I'll just talk about some of the interventions that they did take that a lot of us had been urging. So they added something that my colleague Ellen Goodman calls friction. They added friction. It would slow the spread of some of the misinformation with labels, limits on sharing, even circuit breakers, algorithmic demotion. They tried to boost the signal of authoritative news sources, and they tried to enforce some policies that they had announced in advance. So what do I mean by some of this? I'll just give you quick examples. So Facebook, on the friction side, limited to 5 the number of chats a person can post to in Messenger, and it suspended recommendations for the political and social groups. And then on the signal side, they included links to the Bipartisan Policy Center, but they didn't actually contradict the posts. They just, included those links. Twitter was a little more aggressive. I was a little more heartened by what Twitter did. They took a more aggressive approach to labeling and limiting distribution. Depending on the claim, they would counter misinformation or wrap the tweet in a warning label. And then when people attempted to retweet the content labeled as misleading, they pointed them to credible information. And they even did this with the president, as we all know, repeatedly. And then we've been urging, Ellen Goodman and I, this circuit breaker concept that instead of waiting till something goes viral, you put a pause on it and evaluate if it's breaking your rules. And they hadn't been doing that in the past. So this notorious, for instance, COVID conspiracy theory video had gotten to 20 million people before they'd taken it down. This time they experimented with this circuit breaker concept. The only time we know of Facebook using it was on that New York Post story about the Hunter Biden laptop. But it was interesting. They said, we're taking a pause, we're doing a fact check on it. And YouTube also did some labeling, pending see the latest on Google. They were the least aggressive. And then they all did various things on the micro-targeting that we can get into later. But I think that it was almost like a controlled experiment, because they were all trying different things, but nobody was doing quite enough. And I think what we learned is they all have to do all of it. They can't be picking and choosing. They all need to do more of it, more consistently, and really enforce it. And, Davey was going through some of the statistics and the results of what we've seen, but the evidence that the sludge still dominated the debate is today 30% of Americans think Biden only won through fraud. How useful was this if they were all? And then we looked at some of the outlets that are the fault that repeated prior 3 months. So, I think what I was surprised by was work. I just think it means we need to do them more.
Sort of the canary in the coal mine that we've seen this year around COVID. Now this is going to all start to blend, right? Base. How can we use that knowledge to empower thinking and drive thinking? Really, times they look like they're verifying the information rather than.
I'm glad that you asked, and that you mentioned this week with Jack and Mark. Asked exactly last week on Donald Trump's disinformation around the election only reduced sharing by 8%. Platform sharing more information and sharing side. Not typically, it is not helpful for people to believe that platforms need to take a more aggressive stance. The coronavirus, and I hate to say this, in April say, oh, look at all of the things we're doing. Health mis and disinformation are circulating on WhatsApp that were created in the Obama administration or during the Obama administration. And so this is but also Amazon. There's a ton of mis and disinformation on places like Amazon, whether it's political or health. And so I think we need to, get to the situation we're in right now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It shows that Ebola example shows how it persists for so long. Davey, I'm curious how they've done, how to measure their own success. I've heard from them from doing more around the election. You can raise questions about whether or not they, clearly knew, obviously, after 2016 this was happening. But what's the mood, and what are you hearing from the companies about sort of how they're measuring their own success or failure here?
Because as Ifioma said, this this really presented kind of a runway for them to test a lot of these things like labels and concern affecting the lives and health of millions during the pandemic and use them for the election, are really dissatisfied with where the leadership, honestly, was not willing to take those steps process. So it's the CEOs, especially at flex what he is willing or not agitating for change, but to actually see the change, we will have to rely on.
Karen, I want to go back to something you said about with the circuit breaker idea, and that you solo, we had called on Facebook and then be recommended by Facebook themselves. Decisions are made and largely taken at the top. What are the opportunities to pressure companies, and how do we work in it? So understanding just the baseline of what they're doing is an additional challenge.
Yeah, I would start there. I mean, I think, I'm old enough to remember the early days of the commercialization of the internet. And if there's one value that they've always embraced in the internet, was that we can't figure out these incredibly important decisions that they're making. When the airplane crashes, there is a black box that the FDA gets that data. We got the data on what happened was that the Senate Intelligence Committee made the platforms give up that data so that people could study it. This is, it should not be. Data is made available an arm's length basis for either, independent, how did not just how many did we take down, but, how did the algorithm work? What was, we only know that because they were forced to release this data and change the incentives of the companies, so they're just not right. I mean, just like, in the early days of the car industry, it wasn't didn't make a profit after they had seatbelts and airbags and fuel efficient. Passenger safety became a little more important because it had to. And I think we need to think about that. What do we do to make their stickers, that they would say, let's pause, let's see what's going to happen. Let's not wait until the guy gets the gun and goes to Kenosha. Tifa is causing the fires in Oregon. Let's try to make it seem like every information, this turnkey infrastructure online of outlets that are repeat offender, the punishment that are in the terms of service. There are pages that are coordinating behind the scenes. There are these groups that you mentioned. So there's a lot that's going on. These free expression, it would just be really enforcing their own standards in a.
Yes, makes a lot of sense. Flow of U.S. election information. Do you think on this transparency front, there's an opportunity to really, and felt a responsibility there is wide a lot about the U.S. elections, but of course, it's not the only elections that will be happening, and we have a huge number of elections globally in 2021. So in my mind, I'm thinking, it's just wondering if you have any thoughts about sort of what the opportunity presents itself.
Something that Davey said about the fact that the decisions are made top down. That's 100%. We need to put the people who are doing the actual work first. Those are moderators. Mentioned the 35,000 are not full-time employees getting to the results that we need. As for transparency, is that you're sharing takedown numbers, that is completely useless. If you took down 1 million posts that had to do with COVID misinformation, it could be out of 1 billion. We need to know both the prevalence and the types of mis and disinformation. In the next 6 months or a year, if we're going to have a whole range, we need to have an understanding of it, because much of the misinformation primarily afflict women. And so they need to understand, but we also need to be standardized across companies because every company has different kinds of content. So what we shouldn't do is and what that does is creates a competitive advantage for the Facebooks who still aren't providing the information that we actually need to analyze all of this properly.
Really helpful, and a good reminder about just sort of maybe I wanted to dig into one approach that the platforms took around. Also, I mean, I know there's been some be in the background as it relates to YouTube and just depth of views to sort of trying to be a little bit unlike the others, and if that's working.
To actually get on metrics, and back to that on the measures around pausing political ads. So all of the companies, YouTube has a pause after the election. So Facebook did a pause leading into the election and is paused, for a period that is not, things are helpful. It's better than not pausing, but at the same time, there have ads that have gotten past these restrictions. We saw some reporting around that leading into the election. You can be sure that some of these political ads are still getting past these restrictions now. So in terms, don't know to what extent they're really working that well. And then been applied onto them. There are a few reasons for that. Videos are notoriously the hardest pieces of content to fact check. Unlike text, where you can kind of do searches for text claims and match them against, what's being said out, that people tend to use as a tactic to spread misinformation. There are those things that can automate a lot of spreading misinformation. It's hard to backtrack and find, apply pressure because the visibility isn't as high as some of these other platforms like Twitter and Facebook. Made in terms of video matching and things. And then the last thing I'll say is with the metrics that we rely on so much to fact check volume of interactions, but that doesn't get at the reach of these things, posts in their algorithm and downgrading the reach of these posts. We don't know what the effect of that is. How much does it actually curb misinformation? We don't know any of that. And it's viewed, millions of times, liked and shared 100,000 times. But it doesn't get at the really visible metrics that we have. On CrowdTangle, a classic thing that you'll see is, I've seen chunks of that in viral videos, viral posts, where it's something like 80 to even like 97% of the activity is on personal feeds, which does many times it's been liked. We don't know who is posting it, which private groups are posting it. None of that is visible to us. So just the small slice of what is public is what we can see and analyze. And there's systems that we have in place that, we can recommend. And all of this relies on content moves across their platforms. So, I don't really have a solution. Deserve it, and a push for media literacy for the entire population, because that's how we can handle and tackle this problem. Is we're not spreading misinformation consciously or not. We should.
Absolutely. And I appreciate how you've talked about, some of the challenges specific to videos. And there's sort of, there definitely seems to be a dysfunctional sort of conversation happening, which is provide a little bit of information, but when research is bit insight, both for journalists and researchers and also for policymakers, how can we limited amount that we may have to do, maybe in combination, as Karen said, that would be effective, but unless we know more, we can't be targeted. We can't be surgical about sort of the application of what would be most helpful. That's why it's Karen's interest in a really targeted specific approach, but information is really key to that. We have a viewer question that came from Twitter, which I think actually the current system. Have you seen any approaches that would actually kind of re-envision this potential of connection points, especially during this time? What is the setup and what are some innovations or approaches that you've seen that may actually sort of enliven innovations or examples of that?
I can kick us off. The thought that I have is, the way these algorithms are programmed makes you stay on their platforms longer. So that tends to, but given that it's a choice, they could quite yet. We're only seeing labels being slapped on stuff that their algorithms are already surfacing. So I think if we're thinking about the reimagining of how to wade through the content that's on these platforms, it has to start with what they're surfacing in the first, but that's kind of my first thought here on how to make sure healthy conversations are rising to the top.
The first one, I think, is a shout out to the research community and to and Claire Wardle, her team over there has done an incredible job of sharing information they're finding and that they're seeing. The second thing I think is a shift in mindset on some platform CEOs, but he made a comment about how mis and disinformation and harmful content are not good for the business model. And so the decisions that Twitter is making now are decisions, as Davey said, which has so many issues, but just skirts under the radar because they just refuse to answer questions until they decide that having behavior and their enforcement of policies that they already have. Many of these policies already exist. There's just no enforcement of them.
Yeah, I don't know if this is optimistic, but I'd say I think with the new administration, that's going to involve a communications strategy. And I think there's an opportunity there, which I think the Biden team has some experience with from the Ebola crisis, to really champion accurate information, to rise, to lift up authoritative sources like the CDC and the WHO and the FDA, and what are accurate sources. I mean, they're going to have to. Right now, something like half the population says they would take the vaccine, which is just not enough for the herd immunity. So there's going to need to be a communication mindset here. And, almost taking like an FDR kind of approach where he had these fireside chats and, and where is it going up and what's the safety,
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just listening to the Daily Podcast about how Europe has approached the pandemic. And a lot of that was about transparency and information sharing to create that baseline of trust. And just to build on what you were saying, from about first draft, as sort of the hyper local seems to work to our advantage So I'm going to round us out here just with a speed round of, I guess, building on that optimism or not. What are sort of some key takeaways? What do you wish to leave in the minds of our viewers and others about continued disinformation spread? What is your sort of closing kind of top line messages about what we should be doing and thinking?
It was great that we all focused on transparency. I think, if we did nothing else, I'm not saying we should not do anything else, but if we had to, is focusing a lot as well. So I think if we could just start there, maybe we could start to shift the nation, but I'm afraid that what Davey was saying about how the algorithm is designed to keep people online, that's for a business reason. But maybe if there was some a lot more would be my one first thing, than having the top down from the White House, come from a policy background, updating a lot of our offline rules, whether it's consumer protection or civil rights or campaign finance. Like, we just need to update those rules for the online world. That doesn't have to hurt free expression in any way, but it would just,
Yufoma, do you want to jump in and give us your?
I think whether it's public policy officials, whether it's the platforms, whether it's public health, because that's where a lot of this is coming from. And I think that's where we'll start to see shifts. Yes, there needs to be more enforcement. So there's a trust issue there with platforms. They need to keep their word to the single level. And so we have to address that. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to see much of a difference. If it's not
big challenge, but I think that's the core of what this is. The foundation that we're dealing with here is really helpful. Davey, final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I really want to jump off. I love that point about trust and how misinformation thrives in a low trust environment. And media literacy means that we all should be responsible. We should all take anecdotal things that we've seen, in the stories that I've reported out. Often pulling someone out of a rabbit hole of misinformation can come from friends and family and those personal trusted connections. I know it can be frustrating to kind of reach out or the deep state or things like that. But we do have some good evidence that it is these personal connections, So, that can get people out of misinformation rabbit holes. So I think in that community mindset, keeping on, trying to reach out and trying to provide good information and not giving up on that. And whether that's, again, reaching out to loved ones or supporting your local outlets these days. And it has to be a community effort to get us out of the place that we are and to only help.
Excellent. Well, it's more fulfilling than doom scrolling on Twitter, but also I think that just the expertise and the perspectives that you each really brought forward some commonalities, which are helpful. Thank you so much for the time. I really enjoyed our conversation and look forward to more. Thank you.